So just a big good morning to everybody who was actually in the meeting itself. My name is Andrea Davis. I am the International Programme Manager at the Civil Service College. A big good morning to all of our newbies. I can see there's a few people on there that do actually join us every week. So a big hello to you, and a massive big hello to those who have just joined us for the first time. Just to remind you, this session is being recorded and will last about 1 hour. We will send you the slides along with the recording as well in a few days' time. If you do have your mute button unmuted, and could you please just turn that off? That would be fantastic. We just need everyone to mute themselves so there's no echoing and we can't hear funny noises in the background. And just to make sure that you do keep your videos off at all times as well. So I just want to say again a big hello. I can see more people are coming through. We are joined by our expert trainer this morning, Matt Greenough. Matt has actually delivered a few webinars for us before in the past, so you might recognise his face. Today he is delivering a 1 hour session on how to handle hope. And again, it should last about 1 hour. We do have time for Q&A at the very end, but we want to try and make this as engaging as possible. So I want to try and get some chat going on. So if you just want to put a big hello in the chat box now, ask as many questions as you can throughout. Matt is going to answer those as we go along, so you don't actually have to keep your questions until the end. We want maximum participation. And if there's anything that Matt talks about, if you want to challenge him, if you want to ask him any questions, if you want to get a conversation going in the chat box, that would be fantastic. Okay, so for those that don't know much about the Civil Service College, where we are, what we do, we are an independent training organisation that offers training solutions to the UK civil service and the wider public sector. We have delivered training to not just central government departments such as DEFRA, the Cabinet Office and DWP, but also devolved administrations like the Welsh Government and of course our NHS as well as local authorities. We are based in the heart of Westminster, so Whitehall, just on St James's Park. So please do come and see us in our training facilities when travel does permit and you do feel comfortable to do so. And again, for our international clients, we do actually offer training around the world. So when we are allowed to travel, we do have trainers that would come into your country to do the training as well. Or we do obviously offer the option of coming to the UK and doing your training in London as well when travel does permit and when things are a little bit normal. So please do come and see us. So our training, our course categories and training services. We offer around about 70 to 100 different courses, but these are our course categories as you can see here. So we do training around accountability and governance, leadership and management, professional development, policy, law and legal, media, digital and data, finance and commercial, and equality, diversity and inclusion. We do offer our training both face-to-face as well as virtual. So if there are any training requirements, please do speak to me at the very end. I'll put my email address in the chat box for you, or you can visit our website and we'll give you a bit more information about the courses that we do. Okay, so again, we're joined by the fantastic Matt Greenough, who will be delivering this session. Just a bit about Matt, as you can see here. Matt was Special Advisor in the Welsh Government for nearly 8 years and was former Head of Communications for the Labour Party in Wales. Matt now runs communications consultancy, Word Matters Limited, and of course works with the Civil Service College and has done since 2019, delivering different training courses, speech writing, crisis comms, media writing and executive presence. And we will be obviously talking a little bit more about the full day courses that Matt does offer at the very end. So without further ado, I'm going to stop blabbing, Matt, and I'm going to pass it straight over to you.
Okay, thanks, Andrea, and thanks everyone this morning. Thanks for that great welcome, Andrea. And I think it's it sounds like, from what I've seen in the chat and from what Andrea's saying about how it is in London, I'm in Cardiff this morning. It feels like a perfect morning to be talking about hope. Seeing the sunshine streaming through the windows, spring is in full bloom. I can see trees in full blossom out the window, and it feels like after rough 12 or 13 months for most of us. It seemed like a good time to turn our attention to something more positive. As Andrea mentioned, I've delivered some webinars in the last 12 months on crisis communications and how we've talked about the coronavirus pandemic in particular in speeches and other forms of communication. So it seemed like a good opportunity, having gone through the hard stuff, the grimness, to start talking about hope and something a bit more positive today. And so that's hopefully what today's session will be about. We're going to look at some of what people have got right and wrong during the last 12 or 13 months, and whether the use of hope as a communications strategy or technique is justified through a crisis, and how it can be used in a positive way. And one of the things that I want to try and disentangle this morning is the difference between hope and optimism, and particularly optimism bias, which tends to move our organisations into more slightly difficult territory. And just before we get fully started, as Andrea says, please put questions into the chat box as we go along. I'll stop and ask questions now and again, but if there's anything that you want to ask about as we go along, please do fire in the questions. All the courses that I deliver at the college I try to make as interactive, as informal as possible. It's slightly more difficult to do that in a webinar format, but I'd like to replicate that as much as possible. So I really see this time as your time, not my time, and I'm here to answer any questions or field any observations that you might have as we go along. That would be really helpful. I've seen we've got somebody here from Dundee, somebody here from Leicester, and that's quite interesting, knowing where people are from, because obviously people that experienced the pandemic and the communications through the pandemic in a very different way depending on where you are, depending on certainly, if you're in Dundee, it's the Scottish government are in charge, and their communications techniques have been, markedly different from what we've seen in Westminster. And if people are joining us from around the world as well, I'll be interested to hear about people's experiences outside the UK. So let's start positively, at least with these lines from Emily Dickinson's, one of my favourite poems. Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without words and never stops at all. And I think that sums up quite neatly why we need hope in our politics, in our communications, and even through the hardest times. And even when we try and extinguish hope and it seems that all hope is lost, as this poetry says, it never stops at all. The second that we don't have hope, it feels as though we don't have a future. And hope is really a fundamental thing that defines us, I believe, as human beings. And I think that it's the fuel that we put in the engine to reach almost any of our achievements. And it's not the same as I'll say as we go through as blind optimism, and it is certainly distinct from wishing. Hope actually drives action, whereas these other two things are much more passive. So hopefully today will be one big focus group. So I'm going to need your help to make that happen, to feel how hopeful we're all feeling. So just as a kickoff question, how are you feeling today? Are you feeling, if you think about where we were this time last year, we were just starting to talk about coming out of the first lockdown. Are you feeling more hopeful, less hopeful? If you're feeling more hopeful, what is it that's giving you that hope? If you're feeling the same, what is it that's denying you that level of hope? So if you want to just put into chat a sense of how you're feeling at the moment, even if it's just one word to say more hopeful or less, it would be great to hear. There we go. First one, excited and more hopeful. That's a lovely kickoff.
Good. That's a good start.
And as people are filtering through with those comments, could we move on to the next slide, Andrew?
Yeah, absolutely.
More hopeful but very tired. Yeah, I think that's that definitely rings true. I've got both hope and tiredness really happening for me today, because I was woken at before 6 a.m. by my daughter singing "Happy Birthday" to me. It's her 7th birthday today, and to say that she has been excited about this oncoming birthday is the understatement of the century. So I was started the day in very hopeful fashion, but also I know I'm going to be pretty tired as the day goes on. Some really interesting comments coming through there. We'll come back to that. Cautious but optimistic. I think that's a good way of putting it. So a lot of the courses that I do revolve around speech writing and communications, and so there are fairly familiar characters that pop up whenever we talk about speech writing communications, and Winston Churchill is one. And I think this is a great quote, and he's a man for the quote. But for today's purposes, I think this one fits quite nicely. The future is unknowable, but the past should give us hope. And I think that Churchill is a really good starting point for how we think about hope, how hope can be used in a crisis. And often what we see repeated back about Churchill and other great leaders in moments of crisis in history is that it is the defiance and the hopeful language, and the really sort of the more optimistic, memorable rhetorical devices that they use. And what gets lost a lot of the time is actually that's not all they said, that's not all they did. And if we could just lean on another poet for 1 minute, Coleridge said that if we could learn from history what lessons it might teach us. And I think that sometimes we fail to learn the lessons from how we communicate successfully in a crisis, because we just pick out the bits that are really, really memorable. But what Churchill did, and what FDR also did, and we'll come on to that in a little bit, is that before they delivered their more hopeful, famous lines of language, they would set out very clearly the dangers in front of us as a society, whether that be at wartime or during the Depression. They wouldn't hide away from the more difficult messages, and they would set out that very clearly. And if anybody else can think of good examples through history of people offering hope, that would be interesting to hear. So one of the most famous quotes that we use when we talk about sorry, could we just stay on there for a second, Andrew? Thanks. It is from FDR, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who became president during the Great Depression, and was president all throughout the Second World War. And his most famous quote came from that inaugural address, where he said, "The only thing that we have to fear is fear itself." And that, that sort of really memorable, sort of defiant, hopeful language is the bit that everybody takes away from that speech. But what I find really fascinating about that speech, if you go back and look at the rest of the text, is what else did he say? Before he delivered that line, the opening line pretty much of that speech was, "This is preeminently the time to speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly. Nor need we shrink from the honesty facing conditions in our country today." So he might have been rejecting fear, but this wasn't just idle, happy talk to deliver a lift of the spirits. His assessment of the situation was stark and clear, and what he also went on to say, a host of unemployed citizens faced a grim problem of existence, and an equally great number toil with little return. Only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. And I think that's really the starting point that I want to use for us when we think about how to use hope helpfully. And it's not ignoring the dark realities. It's not the same as being a foolish optimist. That using hope as a legitimate communications inspiration and directive, it's got to be rooted in reality. And I think that if you look at our most successful communicators through history, that's what they understood. They didn't use hope to gloss over the difficulties facing the country or society at any point in time. It was always grounded in that difficult reality. And so I think that line is almost as important, I think, as the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. Is from Roosevelt, is always remember that also included in that speech is that extra sentence: only a foolish optimist can deny the dark realities of the moment. And I think having that grounding is really, really key. So I'm just going to see what people have said about how they're feeling through the chat there. I'm seeing quite a lot of optimistic and hopeful and grateful. Still some caution in there, absolutely. Yeah, really interesting from Cameron there about not back to normal, but what might improve. And we've seen quite a bit of that language, and I think that is. That's why I thought it was good timing to talk about hope today, because I think that debate is really starting to kick in a little bit now about having borne the brunt and made the sacrifices that we've all made. What is the payoff now? What is society going to look like in the future, and who can really properly articulate that? I've seen some really interesting shifts. I don't know if anybody else has seen any in the last few weeks in advertising. Adidas in particular launched a really interesting advertising campaign a week or two ago, in the last few days, about what's possible, and sort of driving this idea of moving from the impossible to the possible. And I think that's when you see, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, marketers and advertisers moving in that direction. It's not on the basis of nothing. Their focus groups and their polling will be indicating that that people are ready for that sort of more positive messaging and about that idea of things not being the same. More hopeful after receiving the first jab, but tempered with the rise of variants. Yeah, from Lindsay, that seems very sensible. I had my first jab as well on the weekend. I was there at 8:30 on a Sunday morning. First one in the door that Sunday.
Keen.
It was a nice way to start the weekend. So. But you're absolutely right. Just that moment of walking through the door and getting that first jab certainly, definitely helped introduce that level of optimism, and I think that's what we're all starting to feel a little bit more now. And just before we move on from the past, to bring it a little bit closer to recent day, and I think one of the leaders that I talk about a lot in the crisis communications course that I do, particularly around the pandemic, is Jacinda Ardern, who I think has been pretty much the poster girl for crisis communications for the last 12 or 13 months. I think what she's done and the way she's led in New Zealand has been absolutely fantastic, and something for us all to learn from. But one of the things I noticed that she was talking about earlier on in March this year was she went back to Christchurch. It was a decade on from the Christchurch earthquake, and I thought that the language she used to address victims, families, and the gathered people in Christchurch was really interesting. She said it touches on that possible impossible thing. She said it's been a hugely difficult decade for the city. At times, I'm sure it's felt impossible. But as we look ahead to the coming decade, I see hope, energy, and optimism. I see Christchurch taking its rightful place among New Zealand's best and brightest cities. And then she ended her speech really interestingly, I thought, having decided to use that Emily Dickinson poem by a New Zealand poet called Helen Lowe, which is called Sparrows. And I thought there was some really interesting parallels there with the line of the poem that she chose, which was, I threw old bread onto the island of grass in our own grey sea and waited, and then finally they came, their wings clouding the sun. I just thought, what a wonderful way to end the speech and to offer that level of hope. But how interesting it was that it had those echoes of that famous Emily Dickinson poem about hope as a winged thing. And so I think even there, in those few short lines from Jacinda Ardern, the hope is rooted in the dark reality of what's happened. It's not dismissing the difficulty. And I think one of the things that you'll see in common when people talk really effectively about coming through adversity is this notion of moving from something that seems impossible at one moment in time to suddenly possible. And what is it that makes that difference? And I think the leaders that do really well are the ones that articulate that well. Okay, so that's a quick dance through history, and let's move up to slightly more modern.
Future.
Not quite the future. We'll get there. I thought I will let you into one of the strange things that keeps me up at night. There are many strange things that keep me up at night, but one of them in particular is I often wonder about what it must be like to attend the annual general meeting of the British Psychologists Society, because I always think, don't they just sit there analysing everything all the time, everything that anybody ever says? How did it actually move from one part of any room to another without analysing what everyone says? And that's something that's strangely troubled me for many years. And then I've suddenly got an insight into what that must be like as somebody who teaches communications techniques over the last 12 or 13 months, because one of the things that I teach most regularly is speech writing and delivering speeches. And by and large, in the UK, we'll have 4, 5, probably maximum 6 standout speeches a year. Really important speeches that take place, that need to be analysed and brought into our teaching, and need to be referenced, and think about what succeeds and what fails about them. Generally they're around party conferences, or if it's an election campaign that year, or whatever it might be, or very rarely a big business speech, but a handful. And then suddenly, we're thrust into the middle of a global pandemic, and we've got daily press conferences and different communications techniques on tap all day, every day. And it is, everything is moving at a bewildering speed, and trying to keep tack of that is, as an educator, as somebody who wants to always look for evolving best practice, as being a mind-boggling experience, let alone the actual practicalities of responding to public health advice as a citizen as well. And so so this is where our collective coming together is definitely an element of a focus group coming together. So I'd be really interested to hear from people what they noticed throughout the last 12 or 13 months in terms of communication techniques that worked or didn't work, things that really stuck with them for good or bad reasons, things that that you think you will learn from in the future. I know that there's definitely things that have interested me, things from the press conferences that I think that our governments in Westminster, Wales and Scotland have got right, wrong, that we can learn from, for example. But on a very simple level, one of the really interesting things that I've been observing, just walking around as we've all done in lockdowns within the vicinity of our front door, is looking at the difference in closed signs on businesses and shops and pubs or whatever it might be, and just looking at how different closed signs and people approaching being closed up for lockdown and the pandemic has made me feel. And I think even these ones here, a very small subsection of ones that you'll see out and about. I was as somebody who's based in Wales, and we had a slightly stricter approach to the first lockdown, and there was a big debate about whether the border would be open or not between England and Wales. And I was slightly uncomfortable with some of these signs appearing at Wales as closed, for example. I didn't necessarily think that those being repeated in the media was necessarily a good thing for the future and the future of the tourist and hospitality industry. The one in the bottom left is fairly standard, fairly simple, which we saw very often. I thought the one in the top left is quite interesting, the date being crossed out.
That one made me laugh.
a hopeful date being pushed to, and I'm sure that probably happened 5 or 6 times for various different around and about. And then finally, the one in the top right that saw variations on this sort of theme from different businesses, which I just found really interesting and hopeful. And I certainly found that just as my experience of the shops and pubs and bars and restaurants, that if there was anything that caught my eye like that, some people had full displays in the window, or rainbows, or thank yous to the NHS, or a slightly more hopeful message, and it just immediately connected me a little bit more to that business. And those are the businesses that I've sort of kept in the back of my mind to think, when all this is over, or when they're reopened, they're the ones that I'm going to be heading back to first, or they're the ones that sort of put a little bit of a spring in my step when I was doing my morning run or whatever. And I just think, something as simple as that about how we explain to our public, to our shoppers, or to whoever our audience is, exactly the same message. I'm not a particularly positive one, that we are closed, that we're shut, and we don't know how long we're going to be shut for, but you can still express that in so many different ways. And leave really lasting impression, depending on how you want to do that. And I just think, as I say, that we will all be spending, all of us who are interested in communications, many years and unpacking what went right and wrong. You could have a whole day's debate on closed signs, I think, and let alone the government messaging. So I'd be interested to see what other people's experiences of that were. There's a message from Leanne saying, living not far from Brecon Beacons, not going down the road toward Penavon, find half the people are fine from outside Wales, very annoying. Yeah, absolutely. No, I totally understood that. My brother lives in Bethesda, stone's throw away from Snowdonia National Park, and same sort of thing happened there. So no, it's not to say that I didn't understand the approach, but it worried me a little bit about what would be the lasting impression from that sort of sign. Okay, if I think we're ready to move on to the next slide. So as I said a few moments ago, I think it's always interesting to see what advertisers and marketers marketing are up to, because they tend to be the ones that spend the really big bucks on focus groups and polling to see where they are with their customers. And I think it's a pretty good acid test for where the public mood is at any moment in time. And I think generally what was interesting to me is that we responded as public, we responded pretty well to anything that gave us reasons to be cheerful during the pandemic. There were absolute boundaries to that, I think. If people were seen to be cashing in or really pushing it, or anything in bad taste, there were 2 or 3 examples of that going wrong. But generally, I think that people really warmed to this sort of thing, which I thought was really nice from the Getty Museum. And if you haven't seen their campaign from last year, then it's a good wormhole to disappear down to for an hour, where they asked people to recreate works of art with household objects from the Getty collection, or from their gathered families. And they were really really hilarious, a lot of them. Some of them are really interesting, some of them were absolutely incredible, but it was just quite a simple ask for people to stay engaged with the museum in a really interesting and positive way. And as I say, I think the experience was from advertisers that there was a Kantar poll, I think, of consumers that was really interesting, which said that only 8% of people thought that brands should stop their advertising campaigns during the COVID pandemic. And I think it was just that was a really interesting snapshot into the fact that people do want something to hope for and some sort of life as normal to carry on as we go through. If you just click through the points, Andrew, there was something from that survey. It's a big survey of 35,000 consumers rather, and this is what they said. So consumers expected their brands to be present and active during the pandemic period, and appreciate the focus on helpful and informative messaging. Interestingly, people really wanted to hear from companies and brands about how they were protecting their own employees, and I thought that was quite interesting. It didn't necessarily have to be about whatever they were selling or whatever their day-to-day business was about. They wanted to hear from brands that they were used to hearing from, but it didn't necessarily need to be about the same thing. People generally responded really, really well to anything that lifted the mood and put positivity and creativity at the heart of their advertising campaigns without making light of the situation. There were some examples of insensitivity that felt opportunistic, and sometimes, and this is why I think a lot of companies did pull back from their advertising campaigns, because things were changing so quickly during the pandemic that you could that something that made sense one week could immediately not. Cadbury's, for example, just launched their Easter campaign this time last year, and it was all about families being together and grandparents being together just as everybody was being separated, and so you can just hit absolute bad luck. But people responded really, really well to anything that was positive, that reflected what was happening, but didn't do so by making light of the situation. And as I say, I think we can always learn from what's going on in the private sector from where people are feeling and what they might be open to in terms of messaging. Okay, should we move on to the next slide? As I say, as we're going along, please do shout out if there's anything that doesn't make sense, or there's I just noticed that Cameron's message in chat there about his the inauguration speech in 2008. Absolutely fantastic, and actually I come onto that a little bit later if we've got time. And it makes the point perfectly that some people I think forget at times, because as he describes himself, Barack Obama, he's the hope guy. Is how he defines himself now. What a grim time he became president. And if you go back to that inauguration speech, it was really interesting. It was very dramatic. It was a really slate grey November, proper stormy Washington skies, and a lot of his speech was grounded in that really difficult economic reality that he was facing. And I think that's an excellent example. So thank you for pointing that one out. Okay, so we've gone through the pandemic. So reason to be cheerful. Do we have reason to be cheerful now? And can we put? And are we? One of the questions that people always ask me when we do crisis communications, particularly because I always reinforce the importance of being genuinely apologetic, rather than the typical politician's apology, which is I'm sorry if you're offended kind of apology. So to move away from that sort of being genuinely open and heartfelt about anything that might have gone wrong during a crisis, it is getting back onto the front foot. When is the right moment to do so? When can you demonstrate hope? And so can we reasonably do that right now? Yeah, absolutely. I think in a grounded way, again, we absolutely can, because all the graphs that we want to be going up are going up, and all the ones that we want to be going down are going down. I think yesterday it was reported that the UK has now hit 10 million people receiving both jabs. The vaccine rollout is performing very well. UK nations are performing brilliantly. By international comparison, the sight of shops opening and pubs opening, giving people a renewed sense of things getting back to some sort of normal, or albeit a potentially, hopefully, new sort of normal. There are suggestions that post-lockdown we'll see much more of a focus of people spending their money in their local town or village. So potentially, lots of good news for the high street that there was a serious source of concern pre-pandemic. And people are starting to travel and move about again. Andrew being a case in point, first day back in London today. All those sorts of hope. And another sign of things returning to some form of normality. Look at the news yesterday. You had Keir Starmer being chased out of a pub. You had Boris Johnson being embarrassed because he didn't remember one of his mayoral candidates. There was an election debate in Wales and Scotland. There was debates over cronyism and sleaze. Everybody got absolutely irate about football clubs and the new Super League, and people talking about wall-to-wall sunshine. So other news is now happening, and other news happening is the greatest sign of all that that people are ready to start to move on to talk about other things. That's got to be a good feeling. It's got to make us think about how we're going to communicate next. But there are absolute risks at this point as well. So what do we think the tone should be from organisations and government? I'd be interested if people have views about that, about what sort of tone you'd be looking for. We saw quite early on in the chat a lot of people saying cautious but optimistic, hopeful but cautious, grateful, tired, some of those lines. I think we've still got quite a lot of emotion and mental health issues to work through. I think we've all been holding on for so long. Somebody said in the comments that they thought they were feeling hopeful till I read out the poem and they felt quite teary. And I think there's a lot of stuff for us that we've been holding back because we've been just living day to day and stuff to get through. And I think one of the risks for governments and all organisations as they shift to a more positive, hopeful sense of communication now, is that they forget all of that and they move forward too quickly and don't want to talk about what was lost and what has been lost, and the difficulties that a lot of people still face. For the hospitality industry in particular, that it's a for a lot of those businesses are a hand to mouth kind of existence anyway, and really the reopening is they don't know which way it's going to go, and so there's still a lot of concern and fear for people's futures out there. So we need to be quite guarded in our optimism. There's a graph just to show up on that slide, Andrew, which I think if you click will appear, and that's the second dose chart as of the 13th of April. And you can see I haven't just put it because Wales is doing so well. Okay, I have put it there because Wales is doing so well. But it's, as you can see, all the nations are streaming ahead with a vaccine there, and it is when you're seeing those sorts of numbers, it can be. The temptation can be to rush forwards, perhaps too quickly. So we just need to be conscious of that. Okay, we'll move on to the next slide. Okay, so as I said at the start, I think, and this is where we need to be careful, and I think where we've been found wanting as communicators over the last 12 or 13 months is that we haven't always differentiated between what is grounded hope and what is actually just optimism bias. And optimism bias is, optimism in itself is no bad thing. In leadership and in life, people who are optimists do well. But optimism bias in a crisis has its dangers. Now, Neil Weinstein produced the first study of what's been known as optimism bias, and he found that people were generally unrealistically optimistic about their future prospects. And again, psychologically, that's probably understandable. It probably helps us to get out of bed on a Monday morning, frankly. But when it comes to leadership in a pandemic, then that's when you really need to park that sort of mindset, particularly when they're allied with other common human biases that we all typically exhibit, outcome bias, confirmation bias, and social proof, to name just three more. When you put all of those things together and try and manage a big crisis, a pandemic this scale, then you can head quite quickly into trouble. So how does optimism bias manifest itself in crisis communications? These are some of the things that you're likely to see. Empty, comforting words, because the pain being experienced is an inconvenience to what leaders feel like they should be doing. So their words of empathy ring hollow. And the opposite of that I would say would be to see what Jacinda Ardern does when facing down a crisis. When she offers words of comfort, that they sound like they really come from somewhere. Overblown rhetoric. When you don't have a plan, people have a temptation to pontificate and use emotive language to dress themselves up in the clothes of leadership without actually taking the tough decisions it requires. And then relying on previous achievements that have got really nothing to do with the crisis that you're looking forward to tackling ahead of you. A lack of evidence or data suggests that serious work has not gone into the problem or crisis being faced, and that the organisation thinks that they can sit out the crisis or bluff their way through. Paternalist and patronising, a suggestion that that as the audience wouldn't be able to fully understand what's going on or appreciate the difficult decisions being made. One of the things that you see really effective leaders do, and I think Nicola Sturgeon has done this really, really well, is bringing the population into the decision-making process, or at least making them feel like they're in the thinking. So it's not just presenting them with fait accompli all the time. It's saying, if X and Y and Z happens, then we can do this. This is what we're thinking about, and bringing people into that sort of that conversation, rather than just presenting people with this is how it is. And then finally, a hostility to challenge. Again, this sense comes across because that everything is okay and everything is in hand and everything is going to be okay. That every challenge to our decision making is somehow a challenge to us as people. Of course everything is okay, because the highly selective optimism bias that we have tells us that everything is okay, and a challenge to that rocks us. And this is what can happen if we get this sort of balance wrong. If we can just have a look at the next slide.
Julie's just put a comment in the chat box there that you might want to read, Matt. It's quite a good point.
Let's have a look. Really tricky to find this suits all at the moment. Some people are feeling sensitive, in some cases very angry. We've had a few comments where parents have felt patronised by certain messages, even when we've tried to be very empathetic and finding it hard to find the right balance. Yeah, absolutely fair point. You could see even from that initial question that I asked, how's everybody feeling? There's real sort of like differences in scale about how everyone's feeling at the moment, and I think, and I suppose that is my, that would be my word of caution. It's just not to make those leaps ahead. Because we're seeing those sorts of numbers around vaccination, and generally the media coverage is a lot more positive, is not to assume that everybody else has already taken those leaps ahead. I think one of the things that's going to be really, really interesting in the elections that take place around the UK, in Wales and Scotland, Northern Ireland, and big mayoral elections in London and West Mids and elsewhere, it is where that anger goes. And I think you're absolutely right, Julie, to say that a lot of people have got this sort of simmering anger that doesn't sit front and centre necessarily, but still gets peaked and brought to the surface very, very quickly by certain things that are said and done. And I think that's that's what I mean when I talked earlier about that. That even though I think generally as a population we are getting into that more optimistic mood, but there's a lot of stuff still not dealt with for us as people and individuals, and as a country. I think we've battened down the hatches a little bit on some of our emotions, and I think it can really bring that to the fore quite quickly when we see something that triggers some of the stuff that we've not yet dealt with. So I think it's a really, really good point. And so I think here are some headlines from about a year ago when it was first mooted that we'd be coming out of lockdown to an extent, and I think this is one of the problems that definitely comes from at that point a real problem with the UK government's communication strategy at this point of the pandemic. I think it improved at different points, but at this point it was still very much politics as normal, and it completely ignored any sort of stakeholder engagement. So none of the devolved administrations knew that this Monday was going to be a loosening of restrictions, and neither did people working on the front line of the NHS. The first time that anybody knew about this is when they picked up their morning paper it was a Thursday morning, about what was likely to happen that next Monday after the cabinet meeting that day. And I think that is really one of the dangers of taking your optimism bias into your media handling. There's a couple more front pages on the next slide, if we can just have a quick look at those. Great. Okay. So I just here's two different ways I think that you can handle good news. And the one on the right I would say is absolutely wrong, and the one on the left I would say is absolutely right. The back to normal by Christmas thing. It's offering hostages to fortune when you're in an uncertain situation. Just simply don't offer deadlines that you might have to miss, or don't offer up those things that you can't 100% deliver. Whereas the 1,000 jabs a minute, it's very specific, and it's tangible, and it's something that's actually happening. One of the really interesting things that I saw Barack Obama do was when he visited the site of Hurricane Sandy in New Jersey. He was interviewed the morning looking around the wreckage in a marina, and he was asked what he could do to help and what he could do to support. And one of the first things he said was that I will make sure that my team, if they're contacted by anybody in the recovery process here, will respond to that call within 15 minutes. And I just thought, what a very simple way of demonstrating that that you get the importance of what's going on, that you want to be involved, that your team is going to be involved, but it is something that is immediately deliverable. It wasn't putting a price tag on how much the federal government would cough up. It wasn't saying that marina would be built up bigger, better, stronger than ever before in 6 months' time. But it was just offering the people on the ground facing problem real tangible level of support. And I think that's a really good lesson to learn from. And as soon as you saw the headlines about being back to normal by Christmas, you almost knew what we could expect, and it wouldn't be normality by Christmas. And so make sure that, again, that your message of hope is targeted around something tangible, something you can definitely deliver. Okay, we go on to the next slide. Now, I chose this picture of Trent Alexander-Arnold before the world of football went into meltdown, and so I hope there's no football fans who are offended by that. But I thought that that particular moment, which was just before he took a quick corner to win the game against Barcelona a season or two back, was quite a good way of expressing what we're looking to try and get across. Is this phrase bounded optimism, which is this is the good optimism. This is the optimism that we want in our crisis communications and crisis planning. This isn't just saying it's all going to be okay. This is how it's going to be okay. It's not the same as optimism bias. So nobody wants to follow a pessimist. People do want confidence and optimism and hope, but they don't want optimism bias either. You don't want wishing. So how it will be okay, there's a clear grasp of the situation. Think back to the examples of FDR and Churchill at the start. They did not shy away from the gravity of the situation in front of them, and people will respond to that honesty. And as somebody mentioned in the chat, Barack Obama's first inaugural address, When he took over the presidency, he was open about the challenges ahead. If you go back and look at that speech, there's some very, hard-hitting messages in there. Ability to answer detailed questions, having a clear grasp of the detail gives you the authority and gives people confidence that you can lead them out of the situation. And giving people a roadmap towards a solution, as I said earlier, I thought Nicola Sturgeon has done this really well. She's given as much detail as you can. That's not always good comms advice, giving a lot of detail, but actually in a crisis, passing on as much of your plan as you can allows people to buy into the journey themselves. Equally, being honest about unknowns. Sometimes wrongly leaders think that they exhibit a weakness by admitting that they don't know everything, but it's much better to do that than offer a hostage to fortune, particularly in a public health crisis where you absolutely need people's trust at a maximum level. Every time you offer up something that you can't deliver, that public trust gets eroded, and that has an absolute knock-on effect to people's health and what happens on the ground. Finally, the flexibility to react. Yes, have a plan, but don't be so rigid in your thinking that you can't adapt to the situation around you. The mess, I think, of the winter lockdowns and the fire breaks show that governments right across the UK become too locked into a vision that they'd given to the public of that nice family Christmas, and became too stubborn to move away from that, no matter what the data was telling. The data was telling all of us as a public that this wasn't going to happen, and yet all our governments were saying, no, you will get your family Christmas in some form. And again, by promising people something that you know that you're not going to be able to deliver, has a really negative effect in confidence for whatever the next message might be. And then finally, the call to action. A great example from JFK about, ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country. And he met the embodiment of that famous line people might know when he went on a tour of NASA facilities in 1961. And he approached a janitor mopping the floor. He was there asking everybody about what job that they did. He asked the janitor, what do you do here at NASA? And he said, Mr. President, I'm here to help put a man on the moon. And that's the sort of buy-in that you want to a call to action and a message of hope. Okay, if we go on to the next bit, just a word of caution, really. It's very difficult for opposition parties to get this right at times of national crisis, between providing scrutiny, which is absolutely crucial, but also then to feel like you're almost willing a government to fail in the most perilous of times. It's a very difficult balance to get right, and I think at different times different opposition parties around the UK got it right and they got it wrong. This is one particular time I think that the Labour Party in Westminster got it wrong. I think Rosina Allen-Khan is a really interesting and formidable politician, and she's somebody who works on the front line in the NHS, so I can understand where the emotion behind this message comes from, absolutely. But actually at that moment in time where where the vaccines were just starting to get rolled out, I just think that was probably the wrong kind of intervention at the wrong time, because regardless of what you might think about the UK government's record up to that point in time, people were ready for some good news, and there was definite progress. And when definite progress is being made, I think people are looking for politicians of all parties to pull together at that particular moment in time. As I say, absolutely understandable, but I just think the tone was a bit off on that particular one. Okay, we'll come into a close now because I want to make sure there is time for some questions. I tried very hard not to make this entire webinar about Boris Johnson. I
think not to.
Yeah, I think in some ways, he's the absolute epitome as a politician of somebody who, whose boundless optimism sort of gets them through, and at times that's been absolutely the right thing, and at times been absolutely the wrong thing. And I could have very definitely done, I think, the entire webinar just by focusing on what Boris got right and wrong at different points in time. And I didn't want to personalise it too much, but I think where sometimes, certainly early on in the pandemic, where that sort of optimism bias what was damaging was in some of that early rhetoric around, we'll all remember the line about Boris shaking hands with everybody in the hospital, and I think that was, a particularly difficult moment that took a long time to recover from. I think people will talk about it for some time to come as well. And I think that is where, hope doesn't become an ally. Hope does become danger's comforter, to use the ancient Greek quote. So I would say that that hope for the best, but then make sure you plan and act to make it happen as well. There's myriad psychological studies that tell us why hope is good for us. It's greater happiness, better academic achievement, even lowered risk of death. It's a valid political tool, absolutely it is, but it shouldn't be confused with optimism or wishful thinking, or worst of all, allowing our leaders to be subsumed by optimism bias. Hope isn't the machinery of government, but it is the fuel, and it's just thinking very carefully about how we use that fuel. I think there's just one final slide of the presentation to show, which is there will be a day where I don't use a line from Andrea Gorman in one of my speeches, but it won't be anytime soon. I think her poem at Biden's inaugural address was absolutely fantastic, and I think there's really good. There's fantastic learning from us there, both in terms of the language, and if you do some of the research about how she came to write some of the content of that poem as well, I think it's a really fascinating story. So by all means, keep that close to you at your desk at all times whenever you're looking to inject a bit of hope in your writing.
Great. Thank you so much, Matt. That was a really interesting, engaging session, especially from our participants. So thank you everyone who has raised their comments and experiences and shared that with us. We've got a slide here with some of the courses that Matt does actually run. And I know this is a pretty new topic, the around hope. Matt, is that correct? Is that something that you're introducing within you in your courses, or something that you already do?
Yeah, no, it's very much something that will be refreshing in all those courses there, really. We've been focusing far too much on unnecessarily on the negative stuff. So this element of how to handle hope will and do it responsibly will form part of those courses there. Yeah.
Absolutely. And if there's anything on there that takes anyone's fancy, or if you want to ask any questions about the courses that you can see on the screen, please feel free to get in touch with me, and we'll liaise with Matt and speak to you about any courses that we can put together for you or your organisation or your team. So this is a part where we'd usually get people to ask questions and whatnot. If you can't think of any questions right now, don't worry. My email address is andrea@civilservicecollege.org.uk. If you do think of any questions later on down the line, please feel free to email me and I'll get in touch with Matt, and I'm sure he would be happy to answer those. But please feel free to use the Q&A box now if there is anything that you would like to ask Matt, and I'm sure he will stick around to answer those. Whilst I just get you to have a good think, I'm just going to move on to the next slide. So we do try to run our webinars, each week. Please do check our website just to see what is coming up in terms of, projects, programs that we're running, courses, live sessions, and so on, at www.civilservicecollege.org.uk, so you can keep up to date with what is actually coming up in the pipeline. And just to let you know that Mental Health Awareness Week is taking place between the 10th and the 16th of May. So many organisations like the Civil Service College will be doing various webinars and sessions, courses and so on. So there will be some news coming out hopefully this week from us about what we're doing in terms of a live session. So we'll be getting that on the website very, very soon. We'll be teaming up with Corgan Page, who is a publisher, and we'll be delivering a session around mental health and resilience in the workplace and at home as well. I think this year the campaigns around the environment. So please do check our website, and we'll be in touch with you all very, very soon about what we are doing for Mental Health Awareness Week. And usually we would have a slide here, but it's not actually popping up for some reason. Oh, there we go. So in order to stay connected, please do check out our Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn and YouTube. At CS College Org is our social media handle, and just check out our website just to see what's coming up. We will send this recording to everyone along with the slides. Matt, I don't know if any questions had come through. Sometimes I do tend to put people on the spot when it gets to the end, and people do actually tend to come back to me throughout the day with some questions. But we've just got some lovely comments just saying thank you very much. Well worth getting up at 4:45. Brilliant. It'd be interesting to find where you're actually from. 4:45. I'm trying to think where in the world that would be. Great comments there. Thank you so much. Again, if you don't have any questions for Matt right now, please do feel free to contact me. Again, it's andrea@civilservicecollege.org.uk, and I'll ping those questions to Matt throughout the day, if that's all right with you, Matt.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I'm not going anywhere. I'm on. I'm just waiting for my very excited daughter to get home from school.
Lovely.
So that's absolutely fine. Yeah, happy to answer any questions as and when they come along.
Brilliant.
Thanks so much for everyone being as engaged as you are. Really useful and interesting comments. Especially right at the start about how everyone's feeling. I thought that was really fascinating, actually.
Yeah, absolutely. No, thank you so much, Matt. And I hope that everyone's been able to take something away from today's session and to have a good think about how you might want to address certain things in your communications around your organisation or within your team or, within your meetings, whatever it might be. So again, this recording will get to you all very, very soon. And a big thank you to our participants that's joined us today. And we'll hope to see you very soon. Okay. Thank you, Matt. Thank you. And I'll see you very soon.
Thanks, Andrea. Thanks,
everyone. See you later. Bye, everyone. Take care. Have a good day. Bye.